Now, with Andrew Marr.
Really, there is only one question which matters this morning. Will the vaccines prove effective against new variants? If the answer is yes, then we're well on our way out of what has been a social and economic nightmare. If the answer is no, well, we are in a bad place. So forget all the secondary chatter. Today's show is going to be concentrated pretty ruthlessly on that one central question. Will they work? And I'm joined this morning by people best placed to give us an answer. Nadhim Zahawi, the minister in charge of the highly successful vaccine rollout programme, and the scientist whose team created the AstraZeneca vaccine so many of us are receiving, Oxford University's Professor Sarah Gilbert. We'll be getting the view of the opposition on that and Labour's direction of travel with its former leader, now Shadow Business Secretary, Ed Miliband. And the latest in our series of leader interviews is with Siân Berry of the Green Party in England and Wales. Casting their eyes over this morning's headlines, Madeline Grant of the Daily Telegraph and Adam Fleming, recently promoted as chief political correspondent of the BBC. Short of having the Queen, the Pope and Joe Biden, I can't really think of a better lineup for you this particular morning. But on with the show, starting as ever with the news from Chris Mason.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning. A small trial suggests the Oxford AstraZeneca COVID vaccine offers limited protection against mild disease caused by the South Africa variant. The company says it isn't yet clear how effective the jab is in preventing people with this strain from becoming seriously ill, but they believe it does offer protection and have already begun to adapt the vaccine to combat the variant. The study involved more than 2,000 people and has not yet been peer-reviewed. Businesses in England with more than 50 staff will be given access to rapid coronavirus testing kits. Previously, the government only offered lateral flow testing to firms with more than 250 staff. The kits provide results in under 30 minutes and will be given to employees who cannot work from home during the pandemic. More than 1,000 people have gathered in Myanmar's main city, Yangon, for a second day of protests. Crowds were heard chanting against military dictatorship and in support of democracy after the country's internet connections were shut down. Comes almost a week after the military seized power. Heavy snowfall is forecast in the southeast of England this morning, with significant disruption expected. Up to 50 centimetres of snow has fallen in parts of Scotland over the last few days. Now weather warnings have also been issued by the Met Office for large parts of Britain. With temperatures falling to near freezing, people are being urged to check in on the elderly and the vulnerable. And a 70-year-old grandfather from Oldham has made history after becoming the oldest man to row solo across the Atlantic. Frank Rothwell completed the trip a week ahead of schedule when he arrived in Antigua yesterday. He has raised more than £600,000 for Alzheimer's Research UK during his 56-day journey. That's all for me. The next news here on BBC One is at 1 o'clock. Back to you, Andrew.
Very many thanks for that. Now, I promised we'd be doing vaccines, and we will be. But before we do, I just want to look a little bit at some of the papers who are doing some other stories, a couple of big economic stories this morning. There's The Observer, first of all, with a letter from the Road Haulage Association to Michael Gove, which talks about exports to the EU falling by 68% since Brexit. That's a very, very big story. The letter's a little bit out of date, but there's a lot more of that inside the paper today. And the Sunday Times has a letter about the government planning a big tax raid, it says, on the huge online companies, Amazon and the rest, who have, of course, done very, very well during the pandemic and the lockdown. Huge profits, but they're not paying very much tax. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like this is going to be in the first budget, but the next budget to come. Nonetheless, a very interesting story there. And then back to the inevitable story. The Sunday Telegraph has lots of stories, actually all packed into one, about vaccines, including the prospects for a vaccine passport for people who want to go abroad and indeed carry out different kinds of jobs coming to the UK. We'll talk about that later on as well. And the Mail on Sunday has gone for Charlie Faulkner, an old friend of Tony Blair. and he has allegedly said that COVID, he says, he was talking about changes in the law, COVID is a gift that keeps on giving, and there's a story there. And then finally there's the Sunday Express, Boris Johnson giving the youth of the nation his thanks. Let us start, however, with the Observer story, which I think is a very important one, Adam.
Yeah, well, it's going to be very important in the next few years as trade with the EU finds a new level as a result of the trade deal negotiated with the EU last year. The government rejects these numbers that have been put forward by the Road Haulage Association in this letter, which was sent a couple of weeks ago. But it's very difficult to actually work out what the new normal is going to be because, of course, there's the COVID effect. And apparently lots of small businesses have been holding back from sending stuff to the continent while they get their processes in order and just see how difficult it's going to be.
And this is less about new taxes than lots of paperwork and form filling.
Yeah, there's a lot more paperwork exporters have to do, and that was a choice the government made. And I think actually officials are pleasantly surprised that there hasn't been more disruption. They were very worried that businesses just hadn't got ready at the end of last year. It does look like they maybe have.
Well, had it not been for the small matter of coronavirus, we would have been talking about nothing else. Maddie, let's talk about another big economic story, the one I was just mentioning there from the Sunday Times. At first sight, it looks like a no-brainer for the government. Tax the rich companies who aren't paying much in corporation or any other kinds of taxes inside the UK, those great big Californian giants, and by doing that, take some pressure off the British high street, which is struggling.
Well, yes, of course, and I think it'll be very, very popular too. James Johnson, who is the former pollster for Theresa May, has done polling and focus groups on this precise issue, and he says people are seriously irritated that online retailers are seen to have thrived at a time that the high street is in turmoil. I think it is important to remember, though, that these taxes very often end up simply being passed on to the consumer. And I think that while they're popular in the abstract, in focus groups and so on, they might just be a little less popular when people realise that it may end up being a kind of effective VAT increase on products that we've been buying during the lockdown at a time of economic turmoil. And people may resent having to pay more in the future for their products.
That's a very good point, Madeline. Thanks so much. Let's turn to the vaccine issue itself. The Sunday Express has a really interesting, quite reassuring double-page spread, which starts, "Don't panic."
Yes, this is a virologist from the University of Leicester saying actually most of the vaccines do work against most of the new variants, and even if they work less well, it is only a little bit less well. And actually when I speak to scientists, they do seem actually not that worried, and they think that maybe we're all being a bit too worried because we hear the word mutation or we hear the word variant, and it's a bit scary.
Well, more from Sarah Gilbert on that later, but it sounds as if we are heading towards a sort of slightly different world in which there'll be a bit of social distancing, and we will be a little more cautious with each other, but the hospitals won't be overwhelmed and we won't have these terrible death numbers.
Well, reading the latest batch of papers from SAGE that were published on Friday, which is when they're regularly released with a bit of a delay, littered throughout those papers, though, is the warnings from the scientists that the last thing that will go down is the number of people in hospital. And also that number could go up if more young people get it, because younger people spend longer in hospital fighting the virus.
Brutally, they're not dying and leaving hospital that way. They're staying on, they're getting better, but it can take a long time.
Yeah, but the main point about that is that the constraint on NHS capacity will remain a very live, important issue in our debate for quite a long time, potentially.
Madeline, one of the other stories in the Sunday Times is about all those people pouring into British airports and into the UK, possibly carrying new variants of COVID with them. And the Sunday Times has a list of countries which have got mutant variants inside them, but are not on Britain's red list to stop people coming in.
Yeah, that's right. It's a very difficult one because, I think Britain has so far been very good at capturing the variants. Its genomic sequencing has been second to none. And I think we will see more and more of this as other countries improve their capabilities, and people start to ask questions about why some people from these countries are allowed to fly, which would be seen to be undermining the kind of lockdown efforts that we've been going to domestically to try to reduce the transmission rate. But I do think that there is also a danger here about when we see an endpoint to these kinds of restrictions, because, as I mentioned, I think we've been very quick at finding these variants. We're only going to find more of them abroad. And if variants abroad is the kind of category for not allowing international travel, then we could be closed off from the world generally for a very, very long time, which is kind of the logical conclusion. Yes.
Yeah, yes. Well, that's not a very happy prospect. Adam,
It's not.
let's turn to one of the possible answers to that, which is the so-called vaccine passport. Now, this would be a little bit of paper or a card which said, yes, Adam Fleming has had both jabs and is now properly vaccinated. And in theory, that would allow you to travel to countries which would allow those passports, or perhaps insist on you having those passports before they allow you in.
Yeah, the government has so far said that they're not going to introduce vaccine passports on a universal basis. They've kept the door open to having them later if they do become a crucial tool. They may have no choice, though, because if countries like Greece insist on you having a vaccine passport for you to go there, well, then the government will have to introduce a British vaccine passport so people can go on holiday. But it also poses the massive political problem because Adam Fleming hasn't had the vaccine. Andrew Marr has. Should there be a situation where you can go on holiday and I can't? Not that I have an opinion on that, of course.
Well, I've had my first dose. It was a very moving experience, actually, going in, seeing how efficient, fast, kindly the whole process was, and completely painless, so I can advertise it.
Still 3 weeks before you've got immunity.
Still 3 weeks. I'm very unimmune right at the moment. There's a little hint in that story in the Sunday Telegraph, which is fascinating, which is that vaccine passports might also be used domestically inside the country, presumably to allow people to go to certain places or perform certain jobs which brought them into contact with the public.
Well, yes, because if you were to introduce them domestically, you'd have to solve the problem of, the equity thing about how do you divide the country over who gets a passport and who gets to do what. So actually, do you make it for very specific things so it seems like a legitimate use of the passport? And also the civil liberties thing. There'd be lots of Conservative MPs that would say, hang on, we're going to divide the country in this way. But if you make it very targeted, maybe that solves the problem.
And once they're available, lots and lots of people will want them for lots and lots of purposes. They will spread and they will become, in effect, a kind of ID card, I suppose. Then there's the forgery problem, so we haven't even talked about that, but that's a serious one.
Yeah, and then there's the international issue because the airlines have been calling for some kind of global standard for travel and safety from the virus for months and months and months and months. And I don't see any evidence that actually we're getting towards an internationally agreed standard for this stuff.
Let's turn to the Labour Party because we've got its former leader, Ed Miliband, on the show later on. And there's an embarrassing story on the front of the Mail on Sunday, Madeline, about Charlie Faulkner.
Yes, it's pretty embarrassing. It's sort of one of those examples where you almost wonder if they kind of said the quiet bit out loud in their head. So Lord Falconer, the Shadow Attorney General, said in a presentation to a law firm that COVID was the gift that keeps on giving to lawyers because of the lockdown restrictions, the law is constantly changing, getting more complicated, and is always more interesting. Now, he says that he said that on the basis of how interesting the law is to study at a time of great change like coronavirus. But I suppose it could also be interpreted that lawyers are making a lot of money from these constant changes of regulation and helping people stay compliant with it all.
We're just living through a period where you have to be very, very careful of your language all the time. There's a lot of disobliging stuff aimed at Sir Keir Starmer in the papers today, Adam, as well, including the suggestion that perhaps the former Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell is being lined up to take him on in some kind of leadership challenge. It all feels a little bit premature to me.
Yes, and it'll also remind you of when you were a political editor, because remember, the Labour left's natural position was to say that the leader of the Labour Party at the time should be replaced by somebody like John McDonnell, which makes you realise them being in charge was the blip, and actually this is what they normally do. Yeah, I think it's very, very early to talk about challenges to Keir Starmer's Labour leadership. He's had a tricky week, yes, not that tricky.
Not that tricky. He had to apologise, of course, to the Prime Minister, Madeline, after that argument about the European Health Agency. But I think for the Labour Party, the bigger issue is why they're not further ahead in the polls at the moment.
Yes, I think that's it. They have really struggled to... I mean, Keir Starmer has now been in charge for quite some time, and I think the problem is that people don't really register him in their thinking. They don't really know what Starmerism is, what he stands for, and he's been accused by some of a kind of opportunism, sort of being endlessly critical of the government and often not being forthcoming on what he himself would do were he in charge.
Well, that is a word, Madeline Grant, I have not yet heard from anybody before, Starmerism. So thank you to that. Thanks to Adam as well. Very interesting. And so to the weather. We've been promised something pretty monstrous later today and for the next few days. Really bitterly cold, high winds, widespread snow. Perhaps we will find Susan Powell in the weather studio has been joking and it's all going to be fine. Or perhaps not.
Well, I'm afraid, Andrew, I think the first guess was right. We're starting to see the whites of the eyes of the heavy snow now across eastern England. The biting wind is picking up. It's an easterly wind. It's pretty raw. The air has originated from the Arctic. Met Office has got an amber warning out for counties stretching from Norfolk as far south as Kent today, where we saw some rain and sleet earlier on. It's turning increasingly to snow now, and some areas could get up to 20 centimetres of snow before we're done with this tail end of Storm Darcy as it pulls out towards the continent. Behind it, though, we're all in a cutting easterly wind. Further snow showers streaming into northern England and Scotland through the day. Some sunny spells, though, towards the west between the showers. It will look beautiful, but the cold wind will mean it will feel raw wherever you are. Top temperatures will possibly just pushing above freezing after a frosty start. Don't forget, ice could be a problem where there's surface water lying anywhere, and factor in that northeasterly wind and it is going to feel particularly bitter. If you miss the snow through the day today, just take a look at what happens though through the evening and overnight as the showers stream further westwards across the Midlands, some getting towards the southwest, across towards Wales, and there's plenty more to come for northern England and Scotland as well. So a very wintry outlook as we move into our new week. Andrew.
Yikes. Now, the pandemic has utterly dominated the news for a year now, but there is an issue even bigger than that. Climate change has aroused the militancy of huge numbers of people, but they've been making themselves felt more through the extra parliamentary action of Extinction Rebellion than through ordinary electoral politics. Is the Green Party, therefore, being elbowed aside? Its co-leader for England and Wales, Siân Berry, joins us now. Siân Berry, welcome. Let's start with the here and now, if we could. So we're living through this strange period of lockdown. You know, you look up in the sky and there are no planes and you can hear the bird song. People are commuting much less. People are working from home much less. Now, there are much more. There are lots of problems, of course, at the moment. But is this a glimpse of the future world that you would quite like to see?
We've got these multiple crises. I think you've pointed out well that we've seen in recent months how much things can change. But let's not forget that we've lost so much during this crisis as well. Almost every day I think about the 112, 113 nearly 1,000 people that we've lost that we shouldn't have. But the relevance of building a green recovery is absolutely huge at the moment. And people see it. People are with us. The climate assembly that the government held, 8 out of 10 of their members said that the recovery out of the coronavirus crisis must be one that takes us to net zero carbon. This is something that we can do that helps everybody. It builds resilience for the next crisis, which is climate change, and gets us out of this one. This is huge stuff. And I think the Greens are so much on the pulse of what people are thinking at the moment.
Well, let me ask you about a specific issue. Do you think the government is right to fund the airline industry, which is at the current state on its knees? Should the government be spending public money to help them?
I think we all need to be thinking about how little we need to fly in the future. I mean, one thing that the Climate Assembly that I mentioned proposed was a frequent...
I'm so sorry. I was asking specifically, do you think the government should be subsidising the airline industry when it's going through a hard period or not?
And we've been arguing for a long time that the airline industry needs to have its subsidies removed. I mean, we need to be transitioning people's jobs. So the important thing for me is that we make sure that we're supporting people, that we're investing in people to change their careers, investing in new industries that we need to give them new jobs. And that is the green recovery. That is investment in things all across the country to give people different ways of getting around, warm up their homes, create resilient local economies. That's the green recovery we need to build. And it doesn't involve bailing out companies. It does involve investing in people, giving them other options for the future.
You say investing in people, but if the airline industry really went belly up, that's hundreds of thousands of relatively high-paid jobs up and down the UK. That's a huge number of people who will lose their jobs in the short term. What plans would you have to actually get them quickly into new jobs?
And we've been arguing throughout the crisis for a basic income for absolutely everybody and for green investment. We were talking about £100 billion a year of new investment in a Green New Deal during the general election campaign a year ago. If we'd put £100 billion by now into new jobs, new opportunities for people, then we wouldn't be having these kinds of questions put to us. But it needs to be got on with as quickly as possible. And I want to talk to people who represent people who work in the airline industry. I know a lot of people have already moved jobs, they're already on furlough, they're working on their next steps. And we need to be listening, talking to people, making it a big mission of the country to transform our economy in all the ways that we need to for resilience and to get us out of this crisis. The last time we had...
I'm sorry to jump in, but if these people lose their jobs now or over the next 2 months, a green recovery might take years to happen. They will have a long period where they are unemployed as a result of the lack of subsidy. Surely the government is right to subsidise them in the short term, the industry in the short term.
I think in the very short term, why not? But we must remember that the government's programme is probably going to be one of continued austerity. And in the last financial crisis, in the last crunch that we had, the government tightened the purse strings and the country never recovered. We were not ready for this next shock that hit us. What the Greens are talking about is long-term sustainability, an economy that is resilient to all kinds of shocks, so that we're not scrambling around bailing out individual industries. We actually have a plan.
In this economy, obviously, people are going to have to move around the country. And for a lot of people, railways remain a relatively environmentally friendly way of doing that. But your co-leader, Jonathan Bartley, has described HS2 as an act of ecocide. There are 9 protesters now underground at Euston. People are risking their lives as they are risking their lives trying to get them out again. Is that the kind of action that you support as leader of the Green Party?
I'm incredibly worried about the safety of those protesters, and they absolutely have a right to protest. And it's important that people are kept safe when they do that as well. Now, on HS2 more widely, we are against this project, and that does confuse a lot of people because we're not against railways. We want to see more railways, but this project has got out of hand. The excessive speed, the fact that it can only go in more or less straight lines, the fact that it's bypassing city centres, all of that is leading to these problems of attacking the ancient woodlands, of going through these very, very sensitive landscapes that people are putting their lives on the line. Their people are going out and living in trees for months on end to try and protect, because these are irreplaceable habitats, and they didn't need to be in the firing line of this project.
Siân Berry, been very good to talk to you. You've got a very busy year ahead. Thanks so much for coming in. Now, the Labour Party hasn't had its best week. Its leader, Sir Keir Starmer, was forced to apologise after a dust-up about his policy towards the European Medicines Agency, which is embarrassing, but to be honest, the kind of thing that's quickly forgotten in the real world. But with 112,000 people dead in Britain from COVID-19 and the country in the middle of another national lockdown, you'd expect Labour to be way ahead in the polls. It isn't, it's behind. What's gone wrong? I'm joined by the former leader of the party, now its Shadow Business and Energy Secretary, Ed Miliband. Ed Miliband,
good to be with you.
111,000 people dead, one of the worst death rates in the country, in the world, and I think the worst death rate of any major country anywhere in the world, and yet the Labour Party, the main opposition party, is behind in the polls. Something is going wrong.
I don't see it like that. The way I see it is that we should focus on what's actually happened in the country. You're right. We've had a terrible number of deaths, and we're going to have to learn lessons from that. One of the lessons we've got to learn from it is the deep inequality in our society, because it's clear that in deprived areas, the death rate is double what it is in less deprived areas. There's lessons to learn about our public services. And you know what? Leaders have good weeks and bad weeks. But what's the most important thing Keir Starmer said since he became leader? That after this crisis is over, there can be no return to business as usual. That means we've got to create a fairer, a more just, a more equal country. And you know,
Boris Johnson says much the same.
Well, and there are massive differences. Let me tell you the differences, and we can already see them emerging. And what you're going to see, Andrew, as we emerge from this crisis, is that these battle lines start to be drawn. So let me give you some examples.
Well,
on universal... No, I'm going to show you the differences.
Give me one example, then I'll ask you a question.
Great, OK. Right. On universal credit, we've said it will be quite wrong to drive hundreds of thousands of people into poverty in this crisis, as the government is planning to do by cutting universal credit in April. Keir Starmer has led the fight to say that would be the wrong thing to do, and the government refuses. So the question of British politics will be who can create that fairer, more equal society, and I believe it's Labour.
All right, we don't know what the government are going to do about universal credit yet, but let me ask you about something we do know, which is the government are going to quite soon publish its criteria for getting out of lockdown. And that's what everybody in the country wants to know. So what are your criteria? What has to happen before you start to lift lockdown, in your view?
Well, I think our criteria are going to be quite similar to the government's criteria. Infection rates, hospitalisation, death rates, and obviously, crucially, the rollout of the vaccine and what is happening in relation to the new variant. I mean, I'll say something which I think is quite sort of maybe surprising, maybe not in this, which is I don't think the government should sort of rush on this. I think they've got a plan, which is to look at this and to make an announcement on February the 22nd. The earliest date that schools can reopen is early March. Talking to teachers in my constituency this week, they say, look, we want this properly planned. And what's the lesson we learn from a year of this crisis? Don't stop and start. Don't exit too quickly. Do this cautiously and judiciously. And by the way, Andrew, have a quarantine system that works. And maybe we'll get onto that. One way of getting out of this, whether it's a quarantine system or not, is vaccine passports are being talked about a lot. What's the Labour Party's view of that? I think we should be open to this. They may be necessary. The way I see it,
being open is not a position.
Well, let me explain. The way I see this is that we've got to obviously get the vaccine rolled out, and it's brilliant the speed of rollout. We've got to have a quarantine system that works, and at the moment the government is proposing a quarantine system that covers just 5% of arrivals that happen each day in the UK. That is not an effective quarantine system. Now, that quarantine system then gives us breathing space to work out what is actually happening in relation to these new variants, and do we need vaccine passports? They may be necessary.
Well, you say maybe. Another former leader of the Labour Party is a lot more clear about that. Tony Blair says an international COVID pass is inevitable, and he says the government should establish a single global vaccine passport ahead of everybody else. He can take a stance. Why should the Labour...
Well, I'm saying we should be open to this, but I think there are complicated issues to do with this vaccine passport, as you discussed with Adam Fleming earlier. Is it just for international travel? Is it about as you go about your business in your society? But if I can make this point, that's got to be looked at. But meanwhile, while that's being looked at, we're 5 or 6 weeks on from the South African variant being discovered. We still don't have a quarantine system in place. We still don't have a plan for a comprehensive quarantine system. So let's proceed a step at a time. Of course, let's look at the vaccine passport, but let's get the quarantine right and let's get the vaccine rollout right too.
I mentioned earlier on Labour hadn't had its best week, and one of the reasons for that was there was a leaked report on Labour values which talked about the importance of the union flag, dressing smartly, supporting veterans. Do you by and large think that to win back working class support you need to be a more patriotic, more obviously patriotic party?
Of course we need to be a patriotic party. I find it pretty surprising that people think it's sort of controversial that Keir Starmer would appear with a Union Jack. He wants to be the Prime Minister of the country. But what is our patriotism? Our patriotism, actually, at this moment, for me, my patriotism is the incredible pride I have in how the British people have responded to this crisis. But I see the contrast between that and the way our country is run. Our public services that have been diminished and underfunded, key workers who are underpaid in our country, a welfare safety net that has massive holes in it, and the task in the years ahead is to match the spirit of the British people with the kind of country we need to be. That's what my patriotism is about. That's what it was about in 1945, after 1945 for the Labour government, and I think that's what you're going to see from Keir Starmer in the months ahead.
Well, neither of us were here in 1945, but let's look at Clive Lewis, one of your colleagues, who responded to that same report saying the importance of the Union flag by saying that Sir Keir Starmer is, and I quote, moving down the track of the nativist right, and that patriotism has a side that touches on the darkest sides of humanity. And a lot of Labour MPs agree with that.
Well, I don't think they do, and I think Clive's wrong about that. I don't agree with him. The flag matters. But
are you proud of the Union flag?
Of course, but I'm particularly proud of our country and the way it's responded to this crisis. But I go back to this point, Andrew. You weren't here in 1945. I wasn't accusing you of that. Don't worry. But what I do believe is we can learn lessons from past crises. What happened after 1945? We went through the trauma of the war, and we said never again are we going to go back to the kind of inequalities and injustices we had in our country. I know Keir Starmer very well. That's what motivates Keir Starmer. That's what fires Keir Starmer. That's why he wanted to become leader of the Labour Party. That is his mission for Britain. And that's what you're going to be seeing. What he's done so far is provided the constructive opposition our country needed. But as we come out of lockdown, as the vaccine gets rolled out, the fight will be for the future of the country.
We need to know more about what you stand for. We need to know more at that point about what you stand for. Let me ask you about values, however, because we both know there are differences in values and attitudes to patriotism and the flag and so forth. There is a very different attitude among some of the younger, more metropolitan supporters of the Labour Party. Do you think that people who don't feel proud about the Union flag shouldn't be in the Labour Party?
No, of course not. Look, people have different views about that. How you regard the flag is a matter of people's different opinions. What matters and what unites the Labour Party, and I actually think what unites the country, and you see this from all of the conversations you have with people, is people think we've been through this terrible trauma, the 110,000 deaths that you talked about. We owe it to the British people to build something better. And, you know, you've seen from Labour the differences. So, for example, you've been talking to Siân Berry about green issues. We've said have a green recovery where we invest 30 billion over the next 18 months to create 400,000 jobs. The government isn't doing that. The government isn't moving on that. You see the government in this crisis freezing public sector pay. So I think there are big differences, and I think the differences are beginning to emerge. But I think it's been right in this period, because I think that's what the country's wanted, for Keir to show the kind of constructive opposition that we have, but also to push the government on the key issues of fairness and how we build a better country.
But there is a gap, is there not, between the views on culture and patriotism and much else of a lot of Labour Party members, you know this is true, and Labour MPs and traditional Labour voters, particularly in the North and the Midlands of England, who turned away from the Labour Party in the last election in large numbers. My question is, how do you bridge that gap?
Well, you see, I think that there is a coalition to be built in this country for a different approach in the future. You know, we've had in the last decade the financial crisis, the crisis of Brexit, and now the injustices and inequalities revealed by COVID. And I think they should all tell us something about the deep inequities of our country. And I think, you know, there's a big coalition to be built for that. We can't just carry on with business as usual. We're talking today about supporting businesses. There needs to be a new relationship between government and business. We're saying that we've got to suspend business rates for another 6 months to keep businesses going through this crisis. Maybe you wouldn't have expected that from Labour, but it's about government and business working together. A proper industrial strategy for the green jobs we need, building up our public services again, not making people live on 74 quid a week on universal credit, not saying to kids, to poor kids, you can't get free school meals during half terms. Those are the values that Keir Starmer's fighting for and that we're fighting for.
Let me ask you about another difficult issue at the moment, which is what happens about this coal mine in Cumbria. Should it open or not?
No, it shouldn't.
Which is bad news for all the people who want to work there in Cumbria.
And we've got to find alternatives for those people. Look, we've just got to be clear about this, which is we can't be opening new coal mines and then claiming to be a big climate leader in our country. The government's going to go to other countries. It's hosting a very important summit in November, COP26, on international climate change, trying to fight climate change. And we're going to be saying to other countries, you can't open new coal mines. And then the government comes along and says, but we're going to open a new coal mine ourselves. We've got to find alternatives.
You picked up the Mail on Sunday this morning and you read the story about your friend Charlie Faulkner. A very embarrassing story for the party, isn't it?
Look, he shouldn't have said it. He was talking in the context of lawyers and the way the law was changing, but it was a very poor choice of words. I've spoken to Charlie this morning. He's very, very sorry and apologises for what he said. And it shows we've got to be careful with our words. All politicians have to be careful with our words.
Particularly, it's offensive to people at this particular time.
Of course, and he knows. And, you know, I know Charlie very well, and Charlie thinks that the country's been through a terrible, terrible trauma, and this in no way reflects his view about the COVID crisis.
All right, Ed Miliband, thanks very much for coming in and talking to us. Now, Professor Sarah Gilbert leads the team at Oxford University that produced the AstraZeneca vaccine. It's become the workhorse of the government's programme, which has already vaccinated more than 11 million people. When I first spoke to her at the beginning of the year, she was quietly confident a vaccine could be found. Now those vaccines are being rolled out and we're gathering more and more data about their effectiveness, not least whether they work, above all, against the new variants. I asked her what the latest data showed.
We published a couple of new data sets this week, which is really good news on the use of the vaccine. Firstly, we showed that when people have the second dose at 12 weeks, the protection that they get, which starts from 3 weeks after the first dose of the vaccine, is maintained up until 12 weeks. So there's no gap in the immunity between giving the first dose and giving the second dose. And then the people who have their second dose at 12 weeks end up with higher antibody levels and higher efficacy against the virus than people who have it with a short interval. So that's a really important finding, and that supports the use of the vaccine as 2 doses at a 12-week interval, which is how it's now being used in the UK. And then we published some more data from the UK showing that the efficacy against the new variant that's circulating, which is called B117, although it's also variously known as the Kent variant or the UK variant or the British variant, but against that virus, the efficacy wasn't diminished. So that's really good news as well. But we did see that the ability of antibodies induced by the vaccine to bind that virus did drop a bit. So that tells us that it's not all about the antibody titers. There are some other parts of the immune system that are helping to protect people against the virus when they encounter it. And then the other piece of information that we saw was the impact on the number of infections from the vaccination in our clinical trials. So we can think of COVID cases as a pyramid with the deaths at the top, the smallest number at the top, and then the severe cases, the hospitalizations, the mild cases, and the asymptomatic cases at the bottom, forming a pyramid. And there are two ways that the vaccine could affect the number of infections in that pyramid. One thing that could happen is that although the vaccine prevents severe disease, hospitalizations, and deaths, it doesn't actually change the number of infections. So what we would see in that case would be more mild and more asymptomatic infections, but the total number would be the same and there would be no impact on transmission. However, that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing an alternative outcome, which is that the size of that pyramid is greatly reduced. It comes down to a third of its original size, and all of the cases that we then see are either mild or asymptomatic.
That is all clearly very good news indeed. But we're also in a situation now where the South African variant is beginning to spread around the country. So what do you know about the efficacy of the vaccine against that?
We're working with partners in different parts of the world to conduct our clinical studies and look at vaccine efficacy. And there will be more data to come out on this shortly. We've had safety data published from the South African trials, and it's been shared with regulators, and there are certainly no safety concerns. But that trial is quite a small trial, so there may not be much opportunity to look at impact on particularly something like severe disease.
Because we know that there's a study being published tomorrow which shows that your current vaccine only offers limited protection against the South African variant for moderate and mild disease. Could that have implications for how we live in the future, if that proves to be true?
What we're seeing from other vaccine developers is that they have a reduction in efficacy against some of the variant viruses. And what that is looking like is that we may not be reducing the total number of cases, but there's still protection in that case against deaths, hospitalizations, and severe disease. So that pushes us more back to the first scenario with the pyramid of cases that I was talking about. Maybe we won't be reducing the number of cases as much, but we still won't be seeing the deaths, the hospitalizations, and the severe disease. And that's really important for healthcare systems. Even if we're having mild and asymptomatic infections, to prevent people from going into hospital with COVID would have a major effect.
The median age of the study that I just quoted, I think, was 31. And we also know that vaccines quite often work less well against older people. So do we have the data to be sure that your vaccine will work among older people against the South African variant?
Well, that's something that's going to come out over time. At the moment, we don't have an intersection of a large number of cases of the South African variant in a population that we've vaccinated, which also has a lot of older people in it. So it's not something we're going to be able to answer immediately.
When do you think you'll know about that? I know there's a lot more work to be done.
I think that's something that might have to be put together from a number of different studies. Unfortunately, we can't always answer all the detailed questions we want to from one single clinical study.
Now, we know that you are already tweaking and reworking the vaccine to cope with new variants. Have you got a version ready yet that would take on the South African vaccine virus?
We have a version with the South African spike sequence in the works. It's not quite ready to vaccinate people yet. But as all the developers are using platform technologies, these are ways of making a vaccine that are very quick to adapt. So last year, all of us took our platform technology, whether it was an adenoviral vector vaccine or an RNA vaccine, and we slotted in the gene for the spike protein that was the one that was common at that time. And this year, we're doing the same again. So it's easy to adapt the technology, develop a new virus, which will have to go through a small amount of clinical testing, not nearly the same amount that we had to do last year. This year, we expect to show that the new version of the vaccine will generate antibodies that recognize a new variant. And then it will be very much like working on flu vaccines. So people will be familiar with the idea that we have to have new components, new strains in the flu vaccine every year to keep up with the main flu strains that are circulating. And there are regulatory procedures that are well established for that. It's called a strain change, and vaccine developers know how to go through that process. So we'll be following that process again in future for the coronavirus vaccines.
So you can work fast and the regulators can work relatively fast. But then, of course, you have to manufacture the vaccine and get it out. Do you think this new version of the vaccine will be available, for instance, for the autumn?
Yes, it looks very much like it will be available for the autumn. We're already working on the first part of the manufacturing process in Oxford. That will be passed on to other members of the manufacturing supply chain as we go through the spring. And it looks very much likely that we can have a new version ready to use in the autumn.
So does that mean that people watching can expect there to be a big vaccine programme with boosters in the autumn? And perhaps that could be the same as the second dose?
Well, we're waiting to gather the information that we need to make those decisions. At the moment, it's all about being prepared. So last year, I started working on the vaccine against coronavirus as soon as I saw the first reports of cases coming out of China, not knowing if we actually needed to have that vaccine, but knowing that if we did need it, we would need it quickly. And we're taking the same approach now. We're getting prepared with different versions of the virus, and we'll be ready if we need to use them.
If this South African variant carries on spreading, and if it's harder to prevent mild and moderate illness until we can get to the boosters in the autumn, what does that mean for the way we behave over the summer and in the interim?
We're going to need to keep a really close eye on the spread of the South African variant in the UK. Obviously, that's something that's happening now, but with the rollout of the vaccine programme going so well, I hope that we'll be able to get ahead of that.
And will this mean, therefore, for instance, we'll have to carry on socially distancing for a bit longer while this is still spreading?
Well, that's not my field of expertise. My job at the moment is to make new versions of this vaccine to be ready if we need to use them, and that's what I'm concentrating on.
Now, the other variant that people are talking about already, not here in any numbers yet, is the Brazil variant, and people are very concerned about that. What are you doing about that, and are you looking at yet another version of the vaccine to cope with that?
Yes, we have multiple different versions in the works at the moment so that we'll be able to make a choice later. There are some similarities between the different variants that are circulating now, but our best plan is to have a number of different options to choose from.
One of the other things that we've heard is that actually mixing and matching the different vaccines can provide higher protection. So you get a first dose of AstraZeneca and then a second dose of Pfizer, or vice versa. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, that's something that I've worked on for many years in other vaccine development programs. We call it heterologous prime boost immunisation, and that just means giving a different vaccine encoding the same antigen for the first and for the second vaccination. And it does tend to give higher immune responses and better protection. So obviously it's something now that we want to look at. Now that there are more than one licensed coronavirus vaccines available using different technologies, but with the same antigen, the spike protein, it's a really good opportunity to put that into a research study and look at whether we do indeed get higher immune responses. It wouldn't be at all surprising if we do.
It's really interesting. You were saying that delaying the second dose can actually increase protection. But is it important that the second dose comes within the 12 weeks that the regulatory authorities have stipulated?
It could probably be a little bit longer than 12 weeks. I don't expect to see any rapid drop-off after 12 weeks. We do recommend that people have the second dose because that's likely to give them much longer-term immunity, and that's what we want to have. So definitely do have the second dose, but don't be too worried if it's 13 weeks rather than 12. I really don't think that's going to make any difference.
It's perhaps unfair to ask you this, but the Pfizer vaccine is supposed to be given within 3 weeks, and a lot of people are worried that anything beyond 3 weeks will be a problem for them. As an outsider, I suppose, in a way, what's your view of that?
Well, we know that immunity after vaccination to any vaccine builds up in the first 3 weeks, and it can still increase after that even if you don't revaccinate. And then it doesn't suddenly disappear overnight. You don't suddenly drop off a cliff edge of immunity just because you've got to 3 weeks after the first vaccination. So I wouldn't be particularly concerned. Obviously, we would like to see some data to reassure us, but I wouldn't be particularly concerned that after waiting for a second dose of the Pfizer vaccine, there would be any deleterious effect.
Now, President Macron famously said that your vaccine was only quasi-effective in the over 65s, and a lot of people piled in and criticised him for that. But since then, Germany, France, Switzerland and Poland have all decided not to give your vaccine to over 65s. What do you think is going on there?
Well, they're saying that they would like to see more data in the over 65s, and that will be possible to provide once the US trial reaches its efficacy readout. but it's not data that we have currently from the UK trial. We did have older adults enrolled in the UK trial, and we had safety and immunogenicity data, but a very limited amount of efficacy data because they were enrolled somewhat later in the study. And also they were obeying guidelines and being very cautious, and they weren't going out and getting infected with coronavirus. So that means that we don't have data on how well the vaccine works. If the people in the control group aren't getting infected, we can't tell if the people in the vaccinated group would have been protected. So what's happening is in Europe, they do have other vaccines that are available. And so they're able to decide if they want to use different vaccines in different age groups. However, we will have data in future showing how well the vaccine works in older people.
Is there going to be a time in the future when your vaccine finds itself ineffective against a new mutation? And what do you do then?
It's very unlikely that vaccines would become completely ineffective. The spike protein that we use in the vaccine is quite a large protein. Part of the protein is involved in binding to the receptor on cells and getting inside the cell. And that's where the mutations are tending to happen. But the rest of the protein has to maintain its same structure. And so other components of the immune response, the T cell response in particular, will still recognize the spike protein and be able to destroy the cells that are infected with the virus and stop the infection from spreading through the body. So a really extreme mutation in the coronavirus will be to lose the spike protein altogether. And that's the antigen that we have in the vaccines. So then we wouldn't have an immune response against it. But of course, such a virus will be completely non-functional. It wouldn't be able to infect cells in the body. It wouldn't be able to make more copies of itself. And so that's not a mutation that's ever going to arise and spread among the population. So it's not one that we would need to worry about.
Well, that is a very, very interesting and, dare I say, cheering thought to end on. Professor Gilbert, thanks so much for talking to us.
Thank you.
I'm joined now by Nadhim Zahawi, the minister appointed by Boris Johnson to head the deployment of the so far highly successful vaccine programme. Welcome, Mr Zahawi. What is your strategy for the South African variant? Are you trying to stop it becoming dominant across the UK?
So our strategy is to continue roll out the current two vaccines, the Pfizer-BioNTech and the AstraZeneca-Oxford, which you just heard from Professor Gilbert on, as rapidly as possible to protect the top 9 cohorts in the Joint Committee for Vaccination and Immunisation. That's 99% of mortality. At the same time, what we've been doing, and you saw that in Woking and in Worcestershire, is sort of hyper local granular surge in testing, tracing, and then isolating, because that's the best way. You know, we've looked at other countries who've done this rapidly as well. And of course, with our 7th vaccine, the Valneva vaccine, where the Prime Minister visited Scotland, that's a whole inactivated virus that works on the body of the virus, not just the spikes. That is also part of our future proofing, so that when the virus mutates, we are ready for it with a variation of the vaccine.
I will come to the future in a moment, but for the here and now, it's the surge testing that's absolutely crucial, presumably. It sounds great, surge testing, but there are 2 big problems with it, aren't there? First of all, only 5% to 7% of positive cases are being tested, and it takes 3 weeks to get the results back, so you are always going to be behind the curve. And secondly, you're doing it in specific postcodes, but people move between postcodes, they commute, they move to work and so on. It is popping up all around the country already. I put it to you that it is going to become a dominant strain across England, and it's already too late for you to do anything about it.
Well, with respect, I don't agree with that, because we already, as of yesterday, vaccinated with the first dose 11.5 million people are the most vulnerable top 4 cohorts. That's 88% of mortality. You just heard from Sarah that the vaccines we're using work on serious infection and, of course, hospitalization and death. That is very much part of what we do to protect the nation. But the surge testing is exactly what we have to do.
Sure.
We ask people to stay at home. They don't commute to work, contrary to what you've just inform your viewers, and then we test them thoroughly. That is what we're seeing being done in other countries. That is exactly what we'll have to do here, as well as, of course, then continue to do the gene sequencing of all the different variants, so that we're always on top of this virus going forward.
if I sound mildly sceptical, it may be because that Matt Hancock told us back in the 23rd of December that a tiered system would keep the Kent variant in the southeast and stop it, I quote, spreading across the country. And it is now the dominant strain in every English region. I again put it to you that because of the inevitable 3-week delay in testing and the speed with which this spreads, it's not going to be possible to stop it entirely by surge testing. And yet we also heard from Sarah Gilbert that to deal with it, there's going to have to be a booster vaccine, which will be available perhaps in the autumn. So are you assuming there will be another vaccine rollout of the same sort of scale as we're seeing at the moment happening in the autumn with boosters to deal with this particular variant and possibly others as well?
Great question. The instruction from the Prime Minister is to roll out the vaccines that are currently approved that offer that protection as quickly as possible to the most vulnerable cohorts. So 1 to 4 by mid-February, 1 to 9 by May, and then carry on doing that. But at the same time, that's the immediate task. At the same time, is planned for the future, which is why we talk to all the manufacturers, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, Moderna, who are doing some work with Novavax, but also we're not just talking to the manufacturers. We have done a deal with CureVac because mRNA, the messenger RNA technology, allows you to produce the next variant in 30 to 40 days and then obviously manufacture it rapidly. So yes, of course, I was speaking to Jonathan Van Tam this morning. We see very much probably an annual or a booster in the autumn and then an annual in the way we do with flu vaccinations, where you look at what variant of virus is spreading around the world, you rapidly produce a variant of vaccine and then begin to vaccinate and protect the nation.
Are we going to have to stay locked down or perhaps have very severe restrictions until the booster vaccine arrives?
Well, so the plan that I think quite rightly, the Prime Minister is being careful and following the data. We have two big programs of looking at testing care home residents daily and frontline healthcare workers. One is called Siren, one is called Vivaldi, both run by Public Health England, which will give us the information by the 22nd of February of the impact of the vaccination program on both infection and transmission. The Prime Minister will then come to Parliament on the 22nd of February to talk about and share with the country the roadmap to initially opening back schools on the 8th of March and then gradually reopening the economy. Of course, at the same time, it'll be a combination, Andrew, of mass vaccination program and the surge testing, tracing it, and really importantly, isolation as well. So, we can talk about, for example,
I'm sorry to jump in, but if the South African variant does
more importantly. That is exactly what we're doing, at the same time as making sure we control for any new variants and have a strategy to bring vaccines or the new variants of vaccines forward. But at the moment, the vaccination program is doing well. We will see some more data by mid-February and we'll share that with the nation.
All right. There is a growing debate about who gets the vaccine when. How much leeway are you going to get from JVCI about who gets up the list? Because there is an argument as between better off people perhaps in their 50s working from home versus younger people on the front line delivering goods or driving vehicles or working in hospitals and police stations and so forth. And a lot of people think they should be a priority rather than it being done simply by age. Are you going to address that?
So if you look at the JCVI 1 to 9 list, if you look at category 6, we're now getting very close. Once we get to mid-February, to go to category 5, which is the over 65s, and then category 6, which is the 16 to 64-year-olds who may have some underlying ailment that would expose them to much greater risk from COVID. They will be captured in category 6, and then, of course, 7, 8, and 9. Phase 1 remains our focus. That is what we will deliver as rapidly as possible by May. Phase 2, we are obviously going back to the JCVI, and we will ask the question whether people who are teachers or shop workers or police officers who are on the front line, who may, through their work, come into contact with much greater volume of the virus, should they be prioritized? And the JCVI will look at all the evidence, all the data, and I'm sure will advise us accordingly. So we keep going down that list. But a lot of teachers, a lot of police officers will be captured in category 6 if they are at risk. And of course, in category 9, if they're over 50.
Right. OK, let's turn to the near future. Well, people are beginning to think about the summer. The Prime Minister of Greece has said that he would welcome people to come on holiday in Greece, but they will have to have some kind of vaccine passport to show they've been vaccinated first. Is that something that the British government is looking at, the idea of a vaccine passport specifically to allow people to come and go in the months ahead?
No, we're not. And there are several reasons why we're not doing that. One, vaccines are not mandated in this country, as Boris Johnson's quite rightly reminded Parliament. That's not how we do things in the UK. We do them by consent. We yet don't know what the impact of vaccines on transmission is, and it would be discriminatory. Of course, you have the evidence that you've been vaccinated held by your GP, and if other countries require you to show proof of that evidence, then that is obviously up to those countries. But we've vaccinated, or we've given the first dose to 11.5 million people, and we have no plan of introducing a vaccine passport.
Right. Can I ask you about the border situation? Is quarantining travellers in hotels when they arrive in the UK from specific countries the best way to protect us from these new variants?
So it's a really good question. The best way to protect us is to quarantine 10 days for everyone arriving in the UK, which is what we're doing. The passenger locator form is mandatory. And just bear with me a second. And the pre-departure testing, the quarantine in hotels, if you are British or resident here and coming from those countries that are risk countries, then that will be introduced in mid-February. But it's one part of a much bigger...
I understand. I do understand that. I do understand that. But nonetheless, figures from the Border Force suggest that at the moment only 1 in 4 passengers are actually being checked. And since June, that would mean 11.4 million people have come through our airports with absolutely no checks whatever. There is a sense that our borders are at least partly still open.
Well, first of all, there's much greater policing of our borders, ports, airports, and, of course, the quarantining. And the passenger locator form now means that the airlines will refuse
when you
travel.
Say, I'm sorry to jump in, Mr. Zahawi. When you say there's much greater policing, does that mean 1 in 3 people are being checked? Because that is the last figure that we can get, and that still means 70% are not being checked.
Well, as I say, the quarantine and the compliance with quarantine has been high. Of course, test and trace captures a lot of people who then feel that they have required a test. That we will look at going further, including quarantine, both in terms of hotels and a quarantine that is mandatory anyway.
You say people are cooperating, but 29% of people who knew they were supposed to quarantine after travelling left the house. This is simply not tough enough to protect us.
Well, look, I make no excuse that we've also issued 45,000 fines for people breaking the different rules associated with this, as well as, of course, given support for the people who need it most. The £500 hardship payment for those who need that money if they have to self-isolate is also in place. Look, the border control, if you look at what Germany did in January, Canada did it in January, is very similar to exactly what we are doing in terms of making sure that you've got the passenger locator form, the pre-departure testing, and 10-day quarantine. And the thing that's really important is our capability now in terms of testing, both in hotels and at home, is much increased. And that will make a huge difference to the outcome for this country, of course, whilst we vaccinate the nation at pace.
Well, let me turn to that, the core of your current job. In the autumn, you now have to provide new boosters protecting against new variants, as we've discussed. You have to give second doses to millions and millions of people, and you have to move down the list of people who need to be vaccinated for the first time. That is a massive, massive logistical issue. Can you do all of that?
So our focus is the deployment of the 2 vaccines approved now. Yesterday, between 11 and 12 o'clock, we got to almost 1,000 jabs a minute, 979 a minute. So the deployment infrastructure, both hospital hubs, 250, the national vaccination centres now 100, the thousands of GPs up and down the country, so about 2,700 sites already up and running. We've got another set of pharmacies coming on top of the 200 that are now vaccinating. The infrastructure that we've put in place.
We're out of time. I'm so sorry, Mr. Zahawi. It's a great thing you're doing there, and it's going very well. But thanks very much indeed for talking to us today. Thanks to all my guests. Thanks to you for watching. Until next Sunday. Goodbye.